For today's episode, I vote that we talk about voting.
Well, I vote that we talk about something else.
Well, your vote doesn't matter because you're a woman.
Darn.
So I guess we're talking about voting today. Specifically, who can vote? How much should that vote be worth? Specifically as it pertains to democracies and republics. Obviously, you don't have voting in monarchies and dictatorships and communism and socialism. So this is just democracies and republics. Any objections?
Sounds good to me.
And we can discuss things like democratic socialism can play into that.
Sure.
But that'll, if it comes up, then we'll talk about it.
I think as socialism pertains to democracies, as you start applying socialism to a democracy, how does that play into who should get a vote? Because
it does matter.
It does. Yeah. It does. So who should be able to vote?
I think it's everybody who lives in the area that would be affected by the policies.
Yeah. Everybody in the geographical distinction for whatever governing body is setting the laws or taking an action.
Sure. You take the Dennis from Monty Python approach of rules should come as a mandate from the masses.
Yes.
So anyone that is going to be affected by the rules should be able to vote in how the rules are generated.
Exactly.
And I somewhat agree with that, I think, to an extent. What about multiple layers of governance? So in the United States, we have state-level government and federal government. And in some states, felons can vote. In some states, felons can't vote. So how should that be differentiated? Should the federal government be able to say, yes, all felons should be able to vote, and then certain states can restrict that and prevent certain felons from voting? How should that work?
I think that it makes sense for each governing body to be able to restrict their own voting, restrict and set their own voting laws to an extent. There are certain things going along with unable to make that decision based off of protected
classes.
Yeah, protected classes.
And I believe that the way that the United States government works is states are able to further restrict regulations by the federal government, but cannot be cannot be more lax. So if felons are forbidden from voting on a federal level, I believe it's restricted. Like you can restrict additional people from voting at the state level, but you cannot then permit felons to vote within your state.
Yeah. And an example, not exactly the same, but the ability of states to control what it takes to be able to vote, whether that's proof of identity.
Voter ID laws.
Exactly.
Yep. The level of verification can change from state to state and from region to region. So I guess let's bring up the first thing, voter ID. Assuming that there are people that can vote, and that has already been determined, what sort of verification process should there be when you're voting?
I mean, you have to know who the people are.
Mm-hmm.
You couldn't just have somebody walk in and be like, yep, I'm Bob Jones, and vote in their district, and then show up to another district and say that they are Sammy Smith and vote over there.
Mm-hmm.
So you have to have some sort of identification in the first place.
Yeah, and I do think that photo ID is a good idea for that identification, but there shouldn't be anything standing in the way of getting that photo ID. I know there have been a lot of restrictions.
Define
placed.
Anything.
Where did I use that in a sentence?
So there shouldn't be anything in the way of getting a photo ID if a photo ID
primarily
is required.
Money, significant time, or
define significant time. If it takes me 3 hours to travel down to government location that can issue a photo ID, I have to spend another hour there. It takes me half a day to go to a location, get a free photo ID, and leave. Is that too much time?
Well, I think it depends on how many days you can do that. I was actually looking into this a little bit, and it turns out that there was one state where, you live in a county, there are no DMVs within your county for you to get a photo ID. You had to travel to a neighboring county whose DMV was open 1 day a week from, say, 7 a.m. to noon.
Okay. And arguably, that's really, really difficult.
Yep.
So, and for a lot of counties where they're kind of out in the middle of nowhere, there's not many people, maybe 1,000 people living in the county or fewer. Maybe you don't even have a DMV. So do you put a DMV all over the place so that they can get photo ID, or perhaps do it by mail? Can you get a photo ID by mail?
If you can accurately prove who you are through mail, then you should be able to do it as such.
Sure.
Yeah, I think that could work.
And it may take longer. You know, you have to wait for transit time for the mail to go
Yeah.
through. You should be able to order online. If you can verify your identity online, should you be able to order a photo ID online for free?
That would be fantastic.
Yeah.
And I think that that is a valid, despite the fact that that would be paid for by taxpayers, because when we say free, we mean provided by the government. I think that's a valid use of taxpayer dollars, because you're trying to maintain the integrity of the government, and that's what taxes are for.
And seeing as we want essentially everyone to have a vote, the ability to vote, if it hinges on any sort of money, suddenly takes a whole set of this population that maybe doesn't have the ability or to pay for that.
If only the wealthy are able to vote, then you end up having, I guess, kind of the capitalist nightmare of monarchies ruling, and only monarchies and the people in the highest, the upper echelons of capitalism.
Plutocracy?
Sorry?
Is that a plutocracy?
I'm not sure what it's called.
I don't know either.
The monocracy. Monopoly democracy. So I think we agree that you should, well, actually, should money or the amount of money that you have increase the value of your vote?
I think that's a tricky subject. Because
I don't think it's tricky at all. I think it's simple.
So. Yeah.
I would say no, it shouldn't affect it.
I agree.
But it often
and the primary
kind of
reason
does.
The primary reason has to do with Pareto distributions, which I believe I've brought up previously. Pareto distribution has to do with seemingly unfair distribution of wealth. That in general, 20% of the population will have 80% of the wealth, and once you get to the extremes of like the richest 2 or 3 people or the richest 5 people, that they have wealth equal to half of the rest of the population. So it's something that comes up in hierarchies, that when you have money, when you have power, 20% of the entities within that structure will have 80% of whatever that structure is about. And this, by the way, also applies to things like stars, that 20% of all the stars in the universe have about 80% of the mass. Because the more massive stars, there are going to be fewer of them, but they're going to be more massive. So you don't want, or at least I think arguably, you don't want 20% to be able to overpower all the other people. In democracies, it's important to protect the minorities.
Correct. And that's part of the idea of the republic as well. You can protect the minorities, and they can have a say even when they are the minority, and even if the majority doesn't think that taxpayer dollars should go there.
So I think what we're getting at is your value as a person should have no bearing on the worth of your vote.
yes.
Yeah. Your monetary value as a person. Monetary or possession based.
I'm going to add a modification to this, and
Okay.
we'll start getting into socialism a bit here. You'll see where I'm going with this. I think positive monetary value should have no bearing on your ability to vote. Or neutral. So if I'm living off in the boondocks, I don't really make money, I don't spend money, I should still have a vote, because I still am subject to the laws of the government. However, if I have a net negative government income, or the government has a net negative income from me, in other words, through various benefits, whether that be unemployment, government housing, healthcare, if the amount of money that I am taking from the government directly that only benefits me, so not things like roads or DMV or registration or anything along those lines, specifically money or value that goes directly to me as an individual, if that exceeds the amount of taxes that I have paid, should I have a vote in the government?
Yes. 'Cause think
Why?
about the situation where the laws are unjust, and that's what causes you to need to depend on the government. So take Walmart, for example, or any big retailer that
Okay.
pays all of their workers minimum wage. You can't survive.
Just I need to jump in. They do not pay all of their workers minimum wage. A
Well,
lot of them don't even start at minimum wage. But go
Yeah.
on.
Where you pay a significant amount of your workers below the poverty line. I will put it that way. Where working a full-time job, there you would not be able to fully support yourself, support maybe children that you have or a family, and if the laws are in such a way that kind of allow the companies to abuse you and prevent you from being able to live your own life, even if you work 40 or in some cases 80 or 100 hours a week,
Mm-hmm.
and you can still barely scrape by,
Mm-hmm.
they need to be able to vote to step in and say, hey,
Of managing those companies. So
Right.
we're
Right.
going off on a deep tangent here in terms of minimum wage versus living wage versus poverty
yeah.
line, where the poverty line is just
I'm just saying that the laws and the control that the government has over the companies that are,
Mhm.
in many cases, causing these people to become a net negative on the government, those people should have a say and should be able to speak up and work to help get themselves into a better place if it is because of the current laws.
Right. And with the way it is, they may not really have a choice. They may not be able to really get themselves in a better position so that they could have a vote. Because if you're working 80 to 100 hours a week, when are you going to get a chance to go to college, maybe get a degree or learn some skills to get a better job?
And if there is a need for a job, as in this thing needs to be done and it needs to be done by a human, then that human should be paid a living wage based off of them working a full-time job.
Again, we're really diverting
Yeah.
from voting in terms of talking about living wage. We'll talk about that minimum versus living and all those other aspects in a different topic. For right now, let's focus on just making money from the government or not. I think let's move away from specific company examples and let's just say automation. As automation becomes more of a thing, people may start just needing to be able to get money from the government because I literally can't find a job with what I can do. And IQ plays a large part in that. In the United States military, they have a minimum IQ of 85 because it was determined, I think, back in the Vietnam era. If you had an IQ under 85, when in military circumstances, you were more of a risk to the people around you than you were worth having. And as automation becomes more and more advanced, I think that the entry-level IQ for entry-level jobs is going to continue increasing, meaning a lot more people are not going to be able to contribute to society. So if we put a limit on you can only vote if you contribute to the government, then as automation becomes more of a thing and more prevalent, then fewer and fewer people will be able to vote.
Yeah, setting aside all the issues that I have with the IQ system and all of the unfairness that it takes into account, setting like the requirement for trained and deeply technical people over time is going to increase, and the availability of jobs that are, I guess, more menial, less thinking, and
It's
more
gonna decrease.
doing, it's going to significantly decrease. So,
Yeah. And so how should that play into who should be able to vote? This also plays into, should you have a minimum intelligence level to be able to vote? I believe it was Benjamin Franklin, it was one of the founding fathers. The best argument against democracy is the common voter.
Yeah.
That there are a lot of stupid people and uneducated people out there that will look and say, I have no idea who any of these people are, but I'm going to throw out a vote. Cool.
Yep. And people who don't investigate the candidates or the ballot measures that they're looking at.
Mm-hmm. So we'll maybe let's come back to making money and focus on just intelligence. Should you have to show a certain amount of intelligence to be able to vote?
based on our current our ability to measure intelligence. I don't like trying to set a hard cutoff anywhere with the intelligence scales that we have.
Determining that cutoff would be I think the only introduction of potential corruption. I mean, it's still a big potential, but IQ is one of the most successful predictors that psychology has been able to produce in terms of predicting lifelong success and your ability to function in society. IQ is one of the most reliable results that has come out of the psychological community.
That doesn't mean it's fair, and that also
I was bringing up with the Pareto distribution, unfair distribution does not necessarily mean that it was nefarious or that it's bad. It just is a truth.
And
IQ is unfortunately a very good predictor of how well you'll do in life. Now again, that still leaves the question of whether or not it should be used.
If the IQ system is biased in such a way, and so is the world around us, and biased in the same way, such that white males...
The entire point of how you create an IQ or measure an IQ is by finding a test that, regardless of how you apply the test, will give the same result every single time to all people. That it is designed, when you design an IQ test, it's designed to eliminate all possible bias, including the questions themselves.
And it is near impossible to remove all possible bias.
And I agree with that. I'm just saying that in terms of psychology, IQ is the test that most attempts to remove bias. But again, we're getting off on another deep tangent. So should IQ play a part? Should uneducated people be able to vote, or should they have an equal vote to someone who is educated and is very involved in politics?
I don't particularly love the idea of somebody who is uneducated voting.
Also, their vote can be more easily manipulated by people who are smart.
Exactly. That's more my concern. Like, yes, I want them to have an equal vote to everybody else, but if they don't really know what they're voting for or getting into, it's really difficult for them to actually support a measure. A great example was back in my hometown, they were trying to put a measure on the ballot to raise property taxes so that they could fund a new school. But the way they had it written was voting no on this measure meant that they were going to increase property taxes.
Yep, and that's something that I've seen the government officials doing of, all right, we want to put forth this measure, and then the opposing party will say, okay, but we're going to word it in a really confusing way to kind of nullify the validity of the vote.
Exactly. There's a lot of that going on, especially in states that allow referendums, where people who live in the state can get enough signatures and put whatever they want on the ballot.
And if you have a low IQ and have trouble recognizing patterns or understanding linguistics, parsing through those double negatives and triple negatives to understand exactly what's being asked can be really difficult, and your vote can be meaningless.
Exactly.
And not so much meaningless, harmful.
It can be harmful, yes, if you intend to vote the correct way. Do you not want to permit felons to be restricted from voting?
Yeah. And,
it's hard to follow.
Right. Even though that was just two negatives, it was still really difficult to follow.
You had restrict also in there, so it's another negative.
Right, so it's triple negative. So, but like...
But that's the kind of stuff we see.
Exactly. So there is an argument, I think, to be made for limiting who can vote based on IQ. But at the same time, I think that most of those specific examples, like with a referendum, those are handled by the people in the government who hopefully have proven themselves respectful enough to be voted into the government, and then they can be the ones to handle a majority of the decisions being made. So I think that while referendums are a specific example, a lot of times it's mostly to get a feel for what does the population want, and then the final decision will be made by the government. So I think that that's a way of protecting against the dumbest of the people in the population. And while referendums kind of become more pointless if you use double and triple negatives, I think that the main decisions should still just remain within the government itself, as opposed to a direct democracy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, referendums should be a popularity vote in that they should instruct lawmakers on what the population wants, but not force the lawmakers to follow what was voted upon. For Brexit, for example, was a referendum, and it has no legal no legal basis. for anything to have happened following the Brexit vote. But the people that wanted Brexit jumped on it and said, "Okay, we're going forward with this."
through with it because we have the support of the population.
Yeah, when in reality they
don't have to.
There's a lot of intricacies there, but they kind of didn't have it.
And they can choose to go against what the referendum said. It just at the risk of, well, if the majority of the population feels this way, then when I come up for re-election, if I work against this and work against the population, I will likely not be reelected. So I think that's a way of, when you have representatives, it's a way of limiting the power that uneducated people have on direct consequences in the government by having representatives. And the representatives, while they may choose to not follow it, they run the risk of then not being reelected or limiting their power in the future. So I think that is a good way of maintaining motivation. Now, we're also talking about representative democracy versus direct democracy. So I guess the question of how can we protect against uneducated voters is better worded as, is direct democracy a good thing? And I would argue no, because of uneducated voters. Unless people are spending all of their time learning about what's going on in the government and staying very, very involved, which very few people are going to do, especially uneducated people that just don't care about what's going on in the government, I think that a direct democracy is absolutely awful, because direct majority rule means that the minority, even if it's a 49% minority, will be completely overpowered. And I believe we brought this up in the last recording. A democracy is two wolves and a sheep deciding what's for dinner. A republic is a well-armed sheep contesting the vote. And I think that we need to protect the minority, and a direct democracy where everyone votes and it's just a direct majority rule, it doesn't work, because the majority will just continue gaining power more and more and more.
I can definitely agree with that at scale.
Yeah.
You know, if you're looking at a state, absolutely you can't really look at every individual in that state very easily.
Sure.
But what about a small town? You know, somewhere in middle nowhere, 100, 150 people.
A small town, I think that's more fair. If they don't have direct representatives or enough representatives to make an effective vote, maybe they don't have a mayor, and maybe they do just run it on a small scale, then maybe it could work.
And how far do you have to break down representation until it's on a fair scale is the other question. Do you break it down such that there's a representative for every million people? So in the U.S., we would have 350 representatives that would each listen to their million people and then vote accordingly based on what they heard or understood there, and that would go into all federal level things. Or do we break it up by state, for example, which, I mean, look at the Electoral College, and then how do we do that fairly? I want to bring
up Electoral College, but let's bring up Electoral College later, because that's going to be a big topic in itself.
So how do we break up this representation in a fair way? Because there are ways to make the minority have a majority vote in a represented system.
Talking about gerrymandering?
Yeah, basically gerrymandering. And how do we do this fairly? Like, based off of just geography? Do we do based off of like a grid? Is that really fair based on how nothing in nature is actually a grid? And it takes a lot of thought to put into that, and the system has definitely been abused in the past.
I think that grids can't work.
I agree with that.
Because cities are just so randomly shaped that you may fall into one grid and then your neighbor will fall into another grid. And that means that they may count differently depending on the number of people in the grid. And
then it gets weird with policies too, because me and my neighbor live in the same neighborhood. So I feel like we should both have the same policies going over us, but
or maybe if the grid goes through a building.
Yeah.
Right, that could be a real fun one.
So like trying to break it up is a big I mean it's a big problem that has been faced for a long time. Do we break it up
particularly with gerrymandering?
Yeah. And do we break it up by the city limits? Well, then who decides the city limits? And then
and if you do subdivisions, okay, well, who decides where the subdivisions are? And for those that aren't aware, gerrymandering is separating and sectioning off areas to lump individuals that are like-minded or very similar to each other together, even if they're distributed. So if you have, let's say, a majority of a city is Democratic and the city gets a vote, you can lump all of the Democratic areas into one location or one subdivision, and then have 10 subdivisions, 9 of which are going to be Republican, 1 of which is going to be Democrat, meaning that the city then becomes Republican. So there are unfair ways of sectioning off cities if the city gets a quantitative vote. And it depends on how many steps removed we are from a direct democracy.
Yep. And so it is a decision, and should we have multiple tiers of representation? Going back to the earlier point of you have maybe one set of representation, and let's just say, for example, 1 million people equals 1 representative at the federal level. So we have 350 representatives. This is a very simplified system compared to what's used in pretty much any country that has a democratic republic. But let's just go for that. 1 million people equals 1 representative. Well, should that be broken up? Should there, for each tier 1 representative, should there be 10 tier 2 representatives that each listen to 100,000 people, and then those, based on those 10 people, vote for that decision basis goes to the tier 1 and so on? How far do we break this up?
I think that what we're getting at is if we are a direct democracy, then we have a one level system of government that everyone votes on every rule. We have a pyramid that is, if you have 100 million people in your area of governance, then it's 100 million people on the bottom, no one on top, everyone votes one level up.
Yep.
If we have a million people get one vote, a majority rule within the million, they get one vote, then there are 100 total votes. They vote on a representative for their million, and then that vote is counted. So then we have a tier 2 level of representation. And I think what we're getting at here is there needs to be a separation of direct voting to legislation. So we're building a hierarchy of voting, and it sounds like we agree that that's necessary to protect from absolute majority rule, that within every level, every time you step up, you represent more and more people, but every step up, the majority rule can take more hold. So, for instance, if we have 1 million people in an area, so like a state has 1 million people, I think that they should be able to vote on their local laws, and then they elect a representative to speak for them for the next level up. So instead of state, let's say a county with 1 million people, they vote for 1 representative. That representative from that county then can vote in the state elections, and they will still have a vote, maybe not valued the same as someone with another county with a slightly smaller population, but they will have a vote in the state election. And then 1 representative from the state elects at the national level. And this is kind of where the electoral college comes in, that there's going to be some variation in the exact populations, but different regions get a certain amount of a certain number of votes, and 1 representative from each area ends up submitting that vote to the national level. And this
you end up with situations where the minority of people overall win, even though
the popular vote does not win.
Yeah.
And for instance, that's what happened in 2016 with President Trump. Trump did not win the popular vote. That went to Hillary Clinton, but Donald Trump still won the election because he had a larger vote in the electoral college. And it was, a 1% difference in the vote?
I think it was 51-49.
Yeah, it wasn't very far off.
And one of the advantages to that is protecting minority rule. And granted, the minority winning seems counterintuitive. The reason the Electoral College was put in place was to protect the votes of more variations of people. So, for instance, if you have, California has a large amount of voting power. A large portion of the population in California votes a particular way because of the way that politics and the way that their system and their way of life. I'm not wording this well. The way they live their lives is very dependent on their location, because they're on the west coast of the United States.
I mean, that can be said about anywhere.
I'm getting to that. It's very, very different than, say, someone in Wyoming or Texas or New York, because they're completely different places in the country. If a simple majority rule were to take effect, then the small places that have a large portion of the population, the 20% of the cities that contain 80% of the population would have complete majority control. So the purpose of the Electoral College is to make sure that the people who are not living in the majority cities still have a say in the nationwide governance. And it's the Electoral College, the entire purpose is protecting minority vote, so that you don't get a runaway of majority continuing to vote over and over and over again and completely take over and crush the minority. That's the purpose of the Electoral College. And it's like we were talking about earlier, it's a hierarchy of every step up you go, you reduce a large number of votes to one vote. And when you do that, there's a certain amount of wishy-washiness of how many votes are there going to be. And sometimes it's going to be fewer, sometimes it's going to be more. So the exact value of a vote is going to change from region to region. And I'm thinking that because a direct democracy, we seem to agree, is bad, because majority will stamp out the minority.
Generally bad.
It doesn't work at scale. I'll put it that way.
It doesn't work at scale, and in order to make it work at scale, you need to modify the exact value of a person's vote. Do we agree on that?
Yeah, there needs to be some representation of the minority.
Yeah.
Which means that the minority will have an advantage in the form of their votes being valued more. And it's more of a minority as in
a
location-based.
Yeah, geographical minority. So when you have very, very population dense areas and very, very population sparse areas, the people
they should have a similar amount of vote.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Because if you have a city with 1 million people and a city with 1,000 people, the city with 1 million people can still govern themselves. They can create their own laws with a more direct, their own levels of governance to whatever degree they see fit. And the city of 1,000, their rights need to be protected as well. So they should have not the same voting power as the million, but
they need
more
to be more
voting
on par.
power per person than the million city.
There's an offset there.
Right. So I think we do agree that different people from different locations should have different weights of vote.
For the most part, yeah. The question should be asked of, should certain things, or do all things need to take into account that representation, or should some things be a pure popularity vote, such as for president, you're electing a representative is really what you're doing.
Yes.
Should
electing the president be a direct democratic vote?
Yeah, versus voting on a policy that is going to negatively impact the minority. The minority should have a larger say.
And I think that, again, because of the purpose of the Electoral College is to represent more viewpoints rather than more people. Because small states with fewer people, but of like the same geographic area, meaning number of varied lifestyles, because lifestyle changes depending on your location. The Electoral College aims to represent lifestyles and not individual people. And I think that that's the value that we get out of the Electoral College. And that's why the Founding Fathers of the United States set it up like that, was to protect from the majority rule and to protect a majority of lifestyles rather than individuals. The people still get a vote, but the people with rarer lifestyles have a slightly stronger vote.
Yeah, and I agree with you that that is very important, because the policies that work in California are not going to work in rural Texas.
Yep. Agree with that.
So, and
I was more of just posing the question on whether or not this type of representation should be used in every situation, or if there are situations that it shouldn't be used for.
For instance, going to war.
Yeah.
That if a country decides to go to war, and I believe we discussed this.
Yeah, we've definitely definitely talked about this before, because the idea that we were talking about was you want your population to support going to war so that they can go to war and you don't have to draft people.
Yep. Right. It was when we were talking about the draft.
Yep.
So should people have to vote, and if they vote against going to war, should they be forced to partake in the war?
Yeah. So let's say that this war is, well, so let's not talk about the partaking in a war. Let's talk about, let's just say if we go to war, 1 out of every 5 people die. Should people in rural places have more of a vote on whether or not 1/5 of people die versus people in big city where there's a lot more
because
people?
while you're representing lifestyles, you're not representing the number of people.
Right.
Now, I'll bring up, just for the sake of throwing a wrench in your argument, a majority of people in the United States military come from rural areas.
This is true. I'm simplifying the example and just saying, let's say
Should a farmer in Kansas be able to say, yeah, let's go to war, and send a bunch of people from California to war?
Yeah. And in the situation where you are dealing with a population cut, essentially,
Yep.
Who gets to decide whether or not that's actually going to happen for whatever reason?
I would say that war is a... That sounds like a good episode. What is war good for? I think that war, because if it's being performed by the government, just like anything else that the government does, and it should be voted on with the system of voting that is in place for the government, which means the people who are making policies at the highest levels are going to be making the decisions about whether or not to go to war at the highest levels. The people who are making policies at a state level should be able to decide if the state goes to war with other neighboring states.
Yeah. So I guess the question it's on my mind right now, and I want to hear your opinion, is should one person be responsible for deciding whether or not we go to war?
And I think that that's something that we should talk about when we do an episode on war, because there are reasons that you need to be able to react quickly, and asking 400 people or 500 people or however many people you have representing you to make a major decision on, hey, so we need to decide whether or not we react and what we do with war and whether or not we should defend ourselves, that can be very strategically bad.
Yeah.
Yep. When you only have an hour to make a decision, you're not going to get all those people to agree in that time.
So I think you may need a point
There
person.
yeah.
I think the question that we're asking the question in an incorrect way. How high up the hierarchy of your voting structure do you need to go for different levels of decision? And I think that should be decided as part of the democratic system or the republic system, is that as the decision gets to a shorter and shorter time frame of criticality, it should go higher up the hierarchy. So if you have a 30-minute response time or a 1-hour response time, you should go right to the top of the hierarchy, one person. And then if you have maybe a day or two, okay, give 2 people. All right, we have a couple of days. Okay, 4 people. Depending on how many people are added for each level of the hierarchy. And I think that it should be determined as part of the system of government what level of voting hierarchy should be used for various topics and various things that come up, like war.
Yeah, I think there'll be a lot of gray lines there.
Oh, yeah.
It's going to be so difficult to quantify everything.
Where it's like, I don't know, this should go between level 3 and 4. And I think that the people that should decide that are the people at level 2.
I think that could work.
And I say level 1 is the very top.
Yeah.
And then level 2 is more representation. 3 is more representation of 4.
Where the government decides essentially what levels can make what decisions. And if some sort of disagreement comes up, you go one level higher.
What area? What part of the food pyramid are you? And can you decide whether does sugar get the ultimate vote on whether
and
vegetables
one of the things that I can hear,
decide.
I can just hear through the mic a couple of people complaining about this of like, well, then you just have the person at the top deciding everything else for the people down below in the hierarchy. It's one of the advantages of separation of powers, at least in the United States, where there are checks and balances between the different systems, from the executive branch to the judicial branch to the legislative branch, to put checks on each other to limit that power. And I think that that's where we stabilize the hierarchies by balancing it against other hierarchies. But the voting hierarchy itself, which means basically the legislative branch, while it should be balanced with the executive and the judicial, it itself should have a say in how the lower echelons of the hierarchy are run to an extent. And those lower echelons should be voted on by the lowest echelon, which is the voting base. Does that sound reasonable?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay,
It
so
helps prevent, I guess, corruption at the higher tiers where one person can use just their personal viewpoint to change everything beneath them. You have those checks and balances between the different branches.
and the way that I'm kind of conceptualizing this in my head, because I like shapes and math, is a triangular pyramid. You've got the judicial, legislative, and executive branch. Each one of those is a side on that pyramid. And within each pyramid, you have a hierarchy with a lot of people at the bottom. And then with each level you go up, it gets thinner and thinner and thinner until you get a point. Without any of those three sections, it will just collapse down. And the other two sides will fall in on each other. And you need the base. Without the base, things become uneven. You don't have a good triangular pyramid. So it's just a way that I'm visualizing it to have a nice uniform, or as uniform as possible, structure. And having the ability to communicate between the branches allows them to self-correct, because if I'm in the judicial branch, I want to make sure that the legislative branch doesn't get too much power. And so I can limit that, but the legislative branch can limit it back. But again, to bring it back into the hierarchies itself. Okay, so we agree that there should be a hierarchy of lots of people at the bottom, and every level up you go, it decreases the number of people that are voting, and the people that are voting are voted on by the lower level. And that is kind of the heart and soul of a representative republic, which is what the United States is. The United States is not a democracy. It's a representative republic. And that's essentially how it works.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
There are problems within that in terms of gerrymandering. But one of the other things we talked about is, and I think that is, would we agree that that's a good axiom, that majority rule is bad, especially because, or direct democracy is bad because you can't protect against uneducated voters, as well as majority rule. So we need to have some representation, and the way that that manifests itself in a stable way is by having levels of hierarchy. The number of people in each level of hierarchy can be determined, but you have the all people, or all people that can vote on each subsequent level, and the higher you go in the level, the more wide-reaching the effects are, and the shorter time frames of things that you're going to be voting on.
So I think you covered a few different things there. So I think one axiom, and feel free to change the wording here, but
there should be levels.
Yeah. Well, so the first part of the first axiom I think that you touched on is fair representation evens the noise and protects the minority.
No.
No.
So the protection of the minority and the protection of lifestyles has to do with the Electoral College, which is...
That's part of representation, though, is it helps there. That is a form of representation.
Let me rephrase. One axiom. The minority should have slightly more voting power per person than the majority. The minority opinion. And how that's defined is in question, but the way that the Electoral College does it is based on your geography, and therefore based on your lifestyle. You will have
assumed lifestyle.
Or assumed lifestyle, yeah. I mean, in general, people who live near each other tend to live similar lives. They're not going to be exactly the same. They may be drastically different. They may have drastically different opinions, but they tend to be very similar. So people who live near each other tend to think similarly, which is why the Electoral College represents lifestyles more evenly than individual people. And I think that is probably an axiom that we can agree on, that lifestyles should be protected more than the individual votes. So, I mean,
yeah, that makes sense.
Agree with that to an extent. If a certain
how
lifestyle.
it's implemented is still in question.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's going to be the
and
tricky
the only
part.
thing that I don't like about your simplification there is, I mean, what if a certain lifestyle is dangerous to the whole? Should that still be protected?
Yes.
Yeah, like the lifestyle of a serial killer. Do we really want to protect that?
Yes.
So if we have a grouping of 100 people, and then that are causing the pollution of a river that serves 1 million people, should their lifestyle be protected if they are causing harm to the entire whole?
And I would say yes, because the point at which that would become a problem, like if you have a very small number of people that are having a very large impact, if they have a large enough impact, then the majority will gain a supermajority and be able to overpower the lifestyle representation. That, for instance, if we're looking at the Mississippi River, and let's say that Kansas is getting a bunch of Kansas is on the Mississippi, right?
My geography is pretty bad.
All right, let's say Nebraska.
Yeah, we know that one.
Sure. Nebraska is on the Mississippi. Minnesota is up at the north end of the Mississippi. If Minnesota decides we're just going to start dumping things in, and it affects Nebraska, it's also going to affect all the other states downstream of Minnesota. They're going to start voting against Minnesota. So the larger the impact, the more people you're going to change the mind of, the more lifestyles you're going to change the mind of, and it will eventually fix itself. So why, if the minority has too large of an effect, then the majority against them will grow to a point where it overbalances the extra power that the minority has.
Yeah, I would agree with that. The introduction of the amount of time it takes to fix it is also something that,
which is
Right.
why
Yeah.
If you have representatives of all those downstream, quite literally, or downriver, those downstream states, if you have representatives in the higher level of government and they say, hey, Minnesota, you are polluting the entire river, and we have of the representatives that are here, of the 6 states that we have, 5 of us say you need to stop doing this. They have a huge majority rule, and then you can take legal action very quickly, because as the problem gets bigger and affects more people, you go up the hierarchy to the levels that have shorter response times and people that can make decisions on a shorter time frame to take effect. So,
But are they really going to have a shorter response time, or is it just going to get caught up in the bureaucracy of going up all those levels?
bureaucracy is a big problem with this, and you're right. As things get more detached, it takes longer to get up those hierarchies and climb up the hierarchy. But that is, it's part of legislation in general. If you want to protect people from unfair legislation, it means that you have to limit the ability of people to act, which also means when something bad is happening, their ability to act should be somewhat limited. It's limitation of government power has the negative side effect of slower reaction time. And I think that government power limitation is a good topic that we can talk about later. So does that make sense in terms of, yes, the minority may be able to affect the majority more and unfairly, but as they do that, the influence against them will grow. The opposition will grow to a point where we have a new balance point. The minority still has a respect and still has sway, but not if it's abused. If it's abused, then they lose that influence. So I'm going to try to summarize again, as I've been trying to, and I'll try to keep the axioms as short as possible, as they should be. Direct democracy devolves into majority rule, which is problematic.
Agreed.
Yeah.
Okay. In order to protect against direct democracy, we have a representative republic. You have multiple layers. Each layer has a representation of an approximate number of people, which is voted on by the previous layer.
Yeah.
Yep.
That's the definition of representation.
I know, but that's what I'm saying with an axiom. For certain things, we may be able to bypass some of those layers. So, for instance, a presidency. the bottom layer will still all cast their vote. There will maybe be one intermediary level, and then they vote on the top level, so that you don't have to continue going up through 15 levels of hierarchy, reducing the number. Sometimes, in a representative republic, you have the bottom layer vote through one intermediary for a top level. And under very extreme circumstances, it's possible to just give a majority vote on what to do.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's a couple of axioms there. And then also as it relates to the Electoral College, lifestyles, while how that's determined is up for grabs and maybe depends on where you are in the world. Lifestyle needs to have a slight, what's the word for preferential treatment? Bias. Voting power should be biased towards lifestyle slightly more than number of individuals to protect various types of people, so that people who hold a minority lifestyle don't have to follow laws that don't make sense for them. Specific example that I can think of is in Alaska, there are certain places where you are, I don't know if it's Alaska. I know that there are places in the world where you are legally required to carry a firearm.
Yep, it's definitely up in Alaska.
Because of the number of polar bears up there. It's like, yeah, you need to be able to protect yourself. So at least someone in your group has to be carrying a firearm. If the countrywide rule is no one can have a firearm, that doesn't apply to the folks in Alaska because they need to have a say. So that's a good, I think, specific, concrete example of lifestyles needing to be respected. So lifestyles should be respected slightly more than individuals. And individuals of the minority should have a slightly more powerful vote than the minority, than the majority. Agreed?
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. That took a while to get to those, but voting is complicated. It deals with a lot of people. One of the things that we were talking about earlier that I want to swing back to is people that are benefiting from a government more than they're putting in. What degree of influence should they have on the government? So we're right now at the time of the recording kind of in a transition period between people need to carry their own weight and contribute to the government. And I can imagine a kind of utopia, but in the future, everything is automated and people can do what they want, meaning that the society in general or government supports those individuals.
Yeah.
So let's say that those are the two extremes. We have everyone is already supplied for. Everything they need is given to them. Right now, we don't have that, and people need to earn what they have.
Yeah, the two ends of the spectrum are really everyone should have a purpose and should contribute to society as that is required, or
and,
the other end, no one needs to contribute to society, and it is everyone has freedom to spend their time exactly how they want to without needing to worry about how they're going to survive.
Yep. I don't think that I think in the latter example, if you are not doing anything with your life or moving humanity forward in any way, then you should not have a vote in that society. So we're talking utopian society of all of your needs are provided. And this is kind of the Star Trek future where no one really has to work. They just do what they want. Should the captain of a starship have more of a vote to someone who spends their entire life playing video games on their own? Should those votes be equivalent in a Star Trek future?
You're complicating things with the Star Trek future aspect. I don't like. I feel like that's overcomplicating things by trying to bring in this entire
specific example. Okay.
Yeah.
A society where needs are met, you can say, "Oh, I want recreation. I want to be able to play guitar." Poof, you have a guitar.
Yeah. If in a society where you don't need to do anything to survive,
in a resource abundant and there are no jobs that need to be filled to maintain the status quo.
mm-hmm.
In that case, who should have a vote. Because that is an extreme example where no one is producing.
I would still say the people that are going to be affected by the policies.
Yeah, because if a ruler of some sort comes in and decides to change everything, I want those people to be able to say, hey, no, we don't want that.
Okay.
Yeah. And let's say we are in this resource abundant future where no one has to do anything to support themselves. It is all just there and they can do whatever they want. Let's say that their lifestyle is playing video games. And
the law is going to be made
yeah.
that will affect them. They should be able to have a say in
Yeah.
the implementation of that law.
Exactly.
So I agree, and I agree with that. When there are no resource restrictions, everyone should have an equal vote. In the way that we had already determined in terms of various lifestyles and still having protection and representation. Still moving forward with those axioms, equal vote. What about in a resource-limited society?
I think that's where things get tricky because people are going to want to keep more things for themselves and do better for themselves. But if they do that, then there won't be enough to go around.
And on the flip side of that point, can people vote themselves more money?
They shouldn't be able to. That's where the checks and balances comes in, really. Being able to...
I'm saying not people in the government voting themselves more money. I'm saying if I am on welfare and I see someone running saying, I'm going to increase welfare, or to bring up something that I brought up earlier in an earlier episode in the Democratic debates, saying, should healthcare be given to everyone, including non-citizens, for free? And all of their hands went up. That is a good example of people voting themselves more money.
So people are voting to say, I don't want to pay for healthcare anymore, therefore they have more money in their pocket.
And that is going to come from the people who are paying taxes. If in that case, you are voting to say the people that are paying taxes have to pay for people who aren't paying taxes and in this specific example, aren't even citizens of the country. So that is a direct example of people voting themselves and people who are not supporting the government free money.
So, I mean, no money, like, really, let's give a more, I guess, basic example of voting for more money for yourself is that, let's say a good chunk of the population makes below living wage, and I know we'll talk about living wage.
Let's not talk. Let's
say minimum wage.
No, let's not even bring in wages. Let's say universal basic income.
Okay.
Should people who do not pay any taxes be able to vote for a universal basic income paid for by the people who do pay taxes?
Yeah. Yes, I agree with that.
You sound hesitant.
Yes, I am hesitant about it because it goes into the problem of, well, they're going to vote for it and there may not be money to actually pay for it.
And also that means that the people who are paying taxes are taking on a larger and larger and larger load as the majority says, oh, well, we can just keep voting ourselves more money.
Exactly.
You have a runaway, and then the people who actually are producing end up losing everything that they produce to people who aren't doing anything, which is why I think that in a resource-limited society, which is what we currently live in, people should not be able to vote themselves more money. Do we agree with that? You should not be able to vote yourself more money.
I don't agree with that.
And why?
Because there are people that are very in tough situations where they are working hard and they are very limited on money because of a system that's holding them down. They should be able to vote to continue to work very hard and still
give them a way
survive.
out.
Yeah.
Okay. What if they aren't working?
Is that considered a lifestyle?
Let's say let's say you're disabled. You have the inability to work. Like, it has been medically shown that I cannot actually do any sort of work. I have some mobility issues, like I can barely move my arm, so I can't type at a keyboard. I have vision issues. I can't see things. And I seriously cannot work. Should I be able to have a vote in voting myself more money? I think that those circumstances are frequently rare enough
Well,
that
they
they would be a
really-
minority that can't really get a majority of, yeah, I'm going to vote myself more money.
Yeah.
Yep.
But in that situation, once again, they're going to be affected by laws that get put into place, and maybe they can't work, and they deserve to live, and in their current situation, without, I guess in your case, more money, as you say, they can't live and actually survive even at the most basic level. That's where their representation and their vote should still count. Is that if they can't survive with the hand that they've been dealt,
Mm-hmm.
they should be able to be dealt a different hand in some way, shape, or form. Like,
You're making the argument that we should help, the government should be expected to help people who are not completely able to support themselves.
yeah,
The concern with that, and again, this is probably going into another topic, is how do you prevent people from abusing that system? And that system is abused.
oh yeah.
That
I mean,
Yeah.
there is definitely
if
abuse.
people can
there.
say, "Oh no, I hurt my leg, I can't work," they're going to milk it for everything they can and get free money for as long as they can. And I've known people that have
Mhm.
done that.
Yeah. And then that it ruins it for the people that are legitimately hurt and unable to work that need
Yep.
that assistance.
And if there are enough of those people that realize that they can just start voting people in that say, "Hey, I will give you free healthcare, and I will give you free this and free this and free that,"
They're going to be voting those people in.
right. And the more people that start becoming reliant on the government, the more they're going to vote people like that in and start gaining a majority rule. So, do you agree that that's a problem?
That people abuse systems.
That if people are willing to abuse a system where they can get free things, and they can keep on voting in people who will continue to give more and more free things and make the system easier to abuse, do you agree that that positive feedback loop is a bad thing?
If unchecked, then yes.
Yeah.
Okay, so how do we check it?
We have the multiple tiers of representation. We have different the different sides of the pyramid that all keep things in check and balances, and we have some sort of governing body, like have institutions in place that can do what they can to prevent abuse. Like
Right.
there
They're
are
not perfect.
there
but
are
them.
investigators that go out, and if someone is claiming unemployment but also working, there's an entire portion of the government that is there to try to find those people and get them like properly.
And with the unemployment
punish them.
example, what about when you can just get unemployment or like work for a month and then get unemployment? It incentivizes not working. And if people are okay with doing that and someone says, "Hey, I'm running for government, I want to restrict the amount of unemployment that you can get," the person that is taking advantage of the system would vote against that. So what I'm thinking is, if you are in a position where you might be taking advantage of the system, where you are benefiting largely from it, more so than you are putting in, you are very much at risk for abusing the system.
Yeah, I mean,
And I think that that's where it needs to be stopped.
Yeah, that's definitely an interesting point too, though, is taking out more than you're putting in. Well, what about somebody who's retired and they paid in all their life to Social Security? Now they're taking out from the government a whole bunch and they're not really putting anything in, but they spent all of their lives putting something in.
Mm-hmm.
Where do they fall on this spectrum?
I don't think that they should count, because the benefits that they're taking out are something that in terms of Social Security, they paid into Social Security, therefore, and they're taking out of Social Security, which means they've already paid for it. They've contributed and are gaining back. So they've paid it ahead. That's the whole point of Social Security, or at least the whole idea behind Social Security. What I'm talking about more is,
a net negative versus a net positive.
yes, and while the dollar amount that you pay in for Social Security is going to be less than you take out because of inflation, the relative impact is going to be about the same. and that's arguable depending on the number of people and whether or not the new individuals that are replacing can actually handle the load. But that's a social
Right.
security issue, not the issue that we're talking about. I'm not concerned about that because they've paid for it ahead of time
Okay.
as part of taxes. What I'm talking about is, let's say I grow up in a poverty-stricken area, and the area that I live in gets handouts from the federal government, and I have literally been just sucking on the government's teat from my birth. I have never worked a day in my life, and all I'm doing is taking money from the government and living in government housing, getting food stamps. Should I have a vote?
If you are purposely abusing the system, then I'm leaning towards no.
Does intent have anything to do with it? Does
Yeah.
intent matter?
I mean, to abuse something, it kind of implies intent.
No. If I'm growing up in a household that is in poverty and my parents are completely living off the government, as soon as I hit 18 in the US, that's the voting age, as soon as I hit 18, I'm still reliant on the government. I haven't been intentionally abusing the system. Should I
Right,
be
that's
able
all
to vote at
you've-
that point?
That's all you've ever known.
Mhm.
So you wouldn't necessarily go out for anything else. And at least in those cases of that being all you've ever known, I would like to give them a chance to be like, hey, this is what you could do to be better.
Mhm.
I think that's an important point is, okay, if we were to do this scenario where they couldn't vote, make sure they have a path forward where they could eventually vote.
And I agree with that. Someone who has been reliant on the government does not necessarily lose their ability to ever vote. That they should be able to get a vote. And this is now that introduces a concept. The ability to vote is something that is earned. Do we agree with that?
Earned may not be the right terminology there. I think the ability to vote is something that can be taken away.
I like that better.
So
But not permanently.
Sure.
There you can gain it back.
Sure. So this is a contentious issue. I don't think that voting is a right. Voting is a privilege because you are affecting other people. And the way that I define, I don't think I've explicitly brought this up, the way that I define a right is something that anyone can do without affecting other people. A privilege is something that you can do that does affect other people, but you are permitted to do so.
I can think of a lot of things that I want to respond there, but I know that they aren't part of this conversation.
Sure.
We can talk about them later.
It's a conversation worth having at a different time. But I think that voting, you are necessarily affecting other people. And if you are unfairly affecting those people, you should, and you have the problem is there's a positive feedback loop that if you're unfairly affecting other people and you have the ability to further vote to give yourself more power to unfairly affect those people, that needs to be put in check directly.
And that's where it gets taken away. So it is similar where you are able to vote unless you have, for some reason, you
for
can't.
instance, felons.
Yeah.
If you
And so you've done something that has caused your voting, you to lose your right.
can a
or
vote
your
can
privilege to
the
vote.
ability to vote be removed?
Yeah, that's what I'm saying.
Okay, so I guess that's a different point that I'm trying to see if we can agree on. Can ability to vote be removed?
Yes.
Yes.
Which means that we agree that not everyone should be able to vote.
Correct.
Right.
What are some examples of things that should be cause your ability to vote to be removed?
I would agree with the felon thing. Being a felon, that is, I mean, doing a felony is like one of the worst crimes.
And part of what defines a felony is voted on by various levels of the hierarchy.
So the people get to choose it.
Right, that felonies are representations of crimes that have a significant effect on other people. You have shown that you are so problematic that you interfere with the functioning of society.
Yeah.
Murder,
Yes.
I think, is the best example of that you very much are interfering
Yeah.
with the
Yeah.
rest of society to function. You are directly affecting another person's life because you killed them. So murder is a felony. You are no longer allowed to vote
Yeah.
because you've proven that you detract from society.
Yeah, so in the rest of the world, that term is antisocial. It means something very different in the U.S., but it is against society when you are antisocial, you are doing something against society, not being asocial, which is being
And I
introverted.
think that antisocial means that you go against the social norm, but if the social norm is a simple majority of 51%, the 49% would be antisocial, and you can't remove their ability to vote.
There's a distinction there. You're working against society, not working against the majority.
Okay.
So doing things like vandalism, murder, anything like that, that is antisocial, as in you are working against society by vandalizing something.
So should vandalizing and spray painting remove your ability to vote?
If the people vote that that's a felony,
If it is voted by enough people that that's a felony, sure. In Singapore, you can get caned for chewing gum, I believe, or at least
spitting out gum.
What?
Doing like spitting out gum
Spitting
or
out
anything
gum.
like that. You can bring gum into Singapore, but you have to be very careful and about how you dispose of it.
And that's because
They
that's
just don't sell it there.
that's what the majority had voted on.
Yeah.
So I think that what is determined being able to remove people's voting power should be determined as part of the voting structure and going up the hierarchies, but you should be able to remove people's ability to vote.
Yeah. I'll make one clarification. Singapore's government structure is such that voting may not really apply. So let's just not say that the majority voted on that, and let's just say that that's the law.
No, but I'm saying that I think based on our previous axioms, the way that those restrictions of who can vote should be determined by representatives that are voted on.
Yeah.
yeah.
Okay. So that at least we give some protection on restrictions of voting. And again, to bring it back to the question that I've been posing is, in a resource-limited society, should people that are net resource negative be able to vote? Should their voting privileges be removed?
I think they need to have some say. Because if, say, this is a person on unemployment and the economy is down, okay, I can imagine them wanting some say to make sure that, maybe their unemployment checks are actually reasonable, whatever reasonable is in their area.
And that can be determined based on the hierarchy.
Yeah.
Right.
If like people that are, just because they are a net negative on the as far as money is concerned on the government, they I keep circling back to this point, but if they are put into an unfair situation based on the current laws and they don't have an easy way out of that unfair situation, they should have the ability
they
to
need
vote.
to have a way out.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay. So it seems like, and I can agree with this, that people who benefit from the government in a resource-limited society should not have no vote.
Correct.
Yes.
They
Should they have an equal vote value? So again, ignoring electoral college, ignoring lifestyle representation, if we just look at people have an equal value of vote, should going net negative contribution to the government cause your vote value to go down? So for instance, if I take from if the average income is $30,000 and some of that goes towards taxes, if my net benefit from the government that I'm taking is equal to the average that another person is paying in, should that be zero? That my vote becomes zero?
No. That goes into
should it decrease at all?
No, not simply based on that fact. It goes into, you should have a vote unless you've done something that caused it to be taken away. Like committing a felony, that's one easy case.
Being a terrible person and getting fired from your job because all of you were obnoxious to all of your coworkers, you have now lost your ability to make money and you're living off of government unemployment. You've proven that you are pushed out of society or pushed out of that particular society, and you're saying, well, I'll just take advantage of the government.
Yeah. There should be some sort of checks and balances there that says, yes, we will initially trust you that you need some assistance while you find another job, in the case of unemployment.
Innocent until proven guilty.
Yeah. And so you have a vote until you have been found guilty of doing something that should take away your vote.
Or of abusing the system.
Yeah. So let's say that the majority votes and says, hey, if you are found to be abusing the system, you've lost your vote now.
Yeah, if the majority agrees, then that fits
so-
with everything else we've talked about.
Or yeah, the
And that
majority
also means that if there's going to be a benefit, there should be an associated protocol for determining if that benefit is being abused.
correct. And then that's where that plays in, is that if you suddenly have to accept social welfare and you are now a net negative, you should be, I guess, given the benefit of the doubt initially.
You should not, just because you're going net negative right now does not mean your votes should immediately be taken away.
Right, because you might be able to find a job
amount.
soon.
Yeah. But if you are found to be abusing the system, then there, I mean, it may not be directly like you're abusing the system, you lost your vote. It's like, obviously there could be like a warning system or whatever.
So intent in this case matters, that there should be checks and balances to find if people are abusing the system. And if it's found that they are abusing the system,
there's a path to losing their vote.
Yes.
Yeah.
So we agree on that. Abusing a benefit system should cause you to lose your vote.
Yeah.
To circle back to where we were trying to set an axiom, I think it's appropriate to say voting is a privilege, but that privilege can be taken away.
Yes.
Yeah, I think we can all agree on that one.
I think that we agree on that. Voting is a privilege that can be revoked.
Yeah.
The way that it should be revoked is go through the
determined by society.
Determined by the hierarchical structure that was set up as part of the Republic. That decides what constitutes revocation of voting privileges.
Yeah.
And as for, again, I'm continuing to bring up benefiting from the government because I think it is separate enough that it should have an axiom that benefiting from the government, there needs to be a system in place for benefits provided by the government to protect against abuse, and abuse of benefits needs to be included in the revocation of votes.
Or the revocation of those benefits, potentially.
Or the revocation of those benefits, or both.
Yeah.
I'd say both.
People should be punished for abusing the system.
Mm-hmm.
That's the short truth of it. Whether that means they lose their ability to vote or they lose their benefits and suddenly are on the street, it's ultimately a punishment on them, and how that punishment takes form is a decision that society needs to have decided upon.
I can agree with that.
Yep, me too. So we've been talking a lot about benefits and voting, and one thing that we haven't really talked about is the voting age. Because that's something that we think about a little bit here and there. In the United States, we typically think of as 18 being able to vote, yet you drink at 21 and the brain isn't fully formed till you're 24-ish. So where should we really be drawing the line?
Brain is fully formed at 21, which is why the drinking age is 21.
It's somewhere between 20 and 30. It's not fully agreed upon. But really, as a society, you to be as fair as possible, you have to set a certain age such that once you reach that age, you've most likely gathered enough experiences to have a meaningful say in whatever you're voting
And
on.
that should be determined by the hierarchy that's set up.
Yeah. So in the U.S., having that set to 18, it was determined as that is the age of which you have finished your required education, and any education beyond that is completely optional, and what you do from then on is entirely up to you.
So that's kind of an interesting point, is 18 is not the age of required education. You can actually drop out of high school in many states at 16.
The fair point, but
I think the point is a little bit moot, though, because really what we're saying is the age at which you are deemed to have enough experiences to have a meaningful vote and a meaningful way of determining what your vote should be is determined by the hierarchy. That happens to be 18. If we want to adjust that to 16, it should be voted on. And if it's a big enough issue, then it becomes something to bring up during the election.
I'll put it this way. The level of expected education is to 18. Maybe not required, but expected.
Sure.
So,
but again, that's decided by the system that is elected.
Yeah, by society. So we've determined in the U.S. that 18 is that cutoff point, and that could be changed in the future, but at the moment, that's what it is, and that's what society deems as enough experience to have a say.
And I think that really applies just in general to who can vote as well.
Yeah.
Women have not always had votes. But as society began to deem it socially acceptable for women to have a vote, it became, yep, we will vote on this. And through the hierarchy that we have in place of representation, we are going to vote for people that will implement the laws that allow women to vote. And I think that we're seeing that as a democracy and as a republic progresses, more and more people will gain the ability to vote as time goes on, as they become less resource limited, and I think freer in regards to the ability of the population to vote. More and more people gain the ability to vote.
So, I mean, to an extent, once, I mean, as it is right now, if you are over the age of 18, you can probably vote unless you've had that privilege taken away.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
So,
But I'm saying we have not all people have always been able to vote.
Correct,
And,
yeah.
and that's an axiom that I'm surprised we haven't touched on at all yet, is who should be able to vote. Should the type of person affect your ability to vote? And we touched on this a little bit with IQ, but what about just inherent features? Being homosexual. In some countries, you can't vote if you're homosexual.
you can be killed if you're homosexual.
You can be
Yeah.
killed.
It gets pretty extreme.
But that's because in those cases, society has deemed it as a crime and an antisocial behavior. And I think in those cases, just for those localities, that's more of a question of overall freedom
And morality, the generally accepted morality.
And within that hierarchy that you have set up, that hierarchy, the base level is your society. And if you go to a different society, they're going to have a different hierarchy set up, meaning that there are going to be different rules. And if you want to start to merge those hierarchies, there's going to be a lot of problems in that, in forming a world government, because you're tearing down the existing hierarchies and replacing them with new ones. And I think that's perfectly fine to do, but I think that within those hierarchies, we should respect the ability of those hierarchies to maintain themselves and govern themselves, because that's the point. If people in countries where homosexuality is illegal, they need the right to be able to govern themselves, even if it results in something negative, because the idea of a representative republic is more important than specific laws implemented by that republic. Do we agree with that? The idea of self-governance is more important than any single detriment that may lead to.
I think generally, yes.
And I realize that saying any...
Yeah, that's why it's
Yeah.
tricky.
It's that absolute in there that makes me question whether or not it should be.
And
the case.
let's meet Godwin's law. I think we've gone on long enough. Hitler was elected and started killing Jews.
Mhm.
And yet, we still have elections. And the fact that Hitler was able to get elected did not make us say we should no longer be able to elect people.
Right. It just happened that a bad person was elected.
Yes. And now, granted, we put into place, okay, how can we make sure that someone like Hitler doesn't get elected again?
Right.
But that's the point. It's a self-correcting system. And it is, or to quote Churchill, democracy is the worst form of government if it weren't for all other forms of government. That I think of what we've found, as we've attempted to lay it out, a representative republic, while it has flaws, while it may lead to things that are unfair, while it may still oppress the minority, it is a system that has the capability, not necessarily the guarantee, but the capability to be self-correcting. And that ability to be self-correcting outweighs any of the negatives, because the fact that it's self-correcting means that if negatives appear, they may still be reversed. Whereas in a tyranny, it's just going to keep going and going and going and going. There's no self-correction in that unless you just completely overthrow the government and wipe it out, which is not built into the system. Representative republic and that form of democracy is the only system that exists that has a self-correcting behavior, and that is more valuable than any of the negatives that could come.
I still don't like the word any of the negatives that could come.
The reason that I
but-
say
Yeah.
any is because if a negative comes up, it has the potential to be reversed.
Yeah.
Whereas other forms of government, it does not have the potential to be reversed unless you completely overthrow the government that implemented it.
Yeah.
That's why. That's why I use the word any.
So you don't need to step out of the system to change the system.
You don't need to step out of. Yes.
Yeah,
It
you
is
can
the
try
only
to-
one that can fix itself from within the system, and that makes it valuable.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Is that it is. Yeah, it's valuable. It's valuable because it can fix itself without needing to tear it down and rebuild. So.
And that's why I use the word any, is because it's the most valuable.
Yeah, might
I,
take
I
a while
like this
sometimes.
wording
but
better. Is really what it comes down to.
Yeah.
might take a long time sometimes to be able to rebuild it, but that's sure better than starting from scratch.
Yep. You may not realize your mistakes right away. It may take a while to fix, but at some point is better than never.
Yeah.
Yep.
And it can be done peacefully.
Yeah.
And I think
Yeah,
I think that's another big thing is it's a self-correcting system of government that doesn't need to be torn down, and it is possible to fix itself peacefully or relatively peacefully without completely killing everyone in the government and then having anarchy for a little while and
Which,
trying to
to
rebuild.
be fair, is stepping outside of the system.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
The system is put in place such that, most modern systems, such that violence is not required and shunned, really,
Mm-hmm.
to try to push for change.
That protests are respected. Violent protests are not.
Yeah.
In general. Some people do, but
Yeah, but as a society, we should not accept violent protests. We should respect people's right to protest
and I agree with that.
peacefully.
Yeah.
Maybe worth bringing up in a separate topic, but
Yeah.
I think
Just
that
because you disagree with someone and they're protesting doesn't mean you hit them with your car.
exactly. So, again, just to kind of put a cap on this, I think we agree that given the axioms that we've laid out and, across the entire recording, we hit quite a few axioms, but the advantage of a representative republic is the fact that it has separation of powers. It is self-supporting from the bottom up. A majority of the rules are determined by or through the consent of the governed, with the protection of the minority in mind. And it is the only system of government that we've come across that is self-correcting, that even when it does have issues, since the minority's rights are protected, it is able to be self-correcting peacefully without collapsing the system itself.
Or exiting the system.
And I think that is why voting being performed by the people governed is so critically important, is because of the fact that it's the only system of governance that is self-correcting. We agree on that?
Yeah.
Yep.
So I vote we close.
Have I earned my vote, or has it been taken away?
We haven't explicitly said that you can't take a vote, so it has not been taken away.
I vote that we close also.
Me too.
All right.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for listening to this discussion. Your interest really means a lot to us. If you want to help support this podcast and our goal of sparking discussions and bringing people together, check out how to contribute in the description. Happy deeping!
The content of this podcast does not reflect the views and opinions held by anyone involved. We will frequently be playing the devil's advocate strictly for the purpose of exploration of ideas and not as an endorsement of any subsequent action. We condemn all acts of violence other than those of self-defense against physical harm.